Welcome to Fridays at Noon. My name is Greg Geeson. I'm the manager of People Development, and today I'm joined by Ken Pinnock, who's the director of People Development, also the DU Change Management Consultant. And today we're going to be talking about change management and how it, from two angles really, Ken.
Yeah.
One is from how to adjust to change.
Yes.
And the other one is just how to implement change. So in many respects, we're talking about the management perspective, how to implement, and many times it's the employee perspective of how to receive change.
That's right.
In the workplace.
That's right, and I appreciate the chance to talk about this topic. At DU, so many things are going and moving around, so it's very timely. So,
all right. So we'll start maybe in a broader way. Why is it people resist change?
You know, on a very basic level, it's biology. Our brains are wired to note anything that's different that could be perceived as a threat. So on a very real level, change is equating a possible threat as far as our brain is. And there's lots of things that go on. And the way to talk about this is that we're hardwired to know and focus on the negative. And an example I use when I'm talking with people about it is think about a friend. They come and they tell you, "Hey, Greg, I met this great person. They're attractive, they're athletic, they like to do outdoor things, they're thoughtful, they've got a great career."
Are you talking about me?
Well, you know, I'm trying to soften it a bit, and they're kind of cheap. So maybe I am talking about you. But you lay all that out, and they're kind of cheap, or they're sort of cheap. What do people zero in on? Oh, really? What do you mean? Or what?
Yeah.
What's that look like? And that happens. It's automatic, and that's our brain. And so, in all sincerity, we are geared in that way that anything that's different, from things that could be perceived as very small, maybe even just changing an office or losing your keys, to then more significant things, our brain is right there.
Okay.
And so that's, you know, on a very deep level, but then it also, what that raises, when anything is a threat, then it's like unknown, and ultimately we're nervous, frightened of the unknown.
So, well, let me have you react to some of these other things. This comes from a handout in your class that we'll talk about toward the end of this on change management. But some of the other resistance, and we can maybe see what you have to say. So part of it is it isn't self-initiated. So what do they mean by that?
It means when it's not me controlling, then I have less control.
Okay. Yeah.
So then it's being thrust on me.
Yeah.
And there can be a number of reasons why we would push against. And we talk about that. But often if it's not my idea, I have less control.
Okay. Routine is disrupted.
We're habit. Everything we do is about habit.
Yeah.
And so anytime there's a change, we actually start having to literally think differently.
Yeah.
And puts us out of our norm.
The purpose of change is unclear.
Goes back to uncertainty.
Yeah.
And fear.
Yeah.
What's really going on?
Yeah.
We hear this when, if my role is changing, well, what does that mean? My role is changing. Is it because I'm not doing well? Is it because the organization needs something different?
Right.
So, and then we default to often there's something must be wrong with me.
Here's one that's interesting is the rewards for change don't match the effort change requires.
Well, depends on what you're trying to change, right? So if the change is something that is pertinent for health, that you have to do this, or there could be serious consequences, sometimes that will move us. And then if it's what's in it for me, the WIFM, if it's not really viewed that positive, like, well, I'm not interested in doing that kind of work, or I won't get anything for it, then that we can push more against that. The thing with change, though, is there's fatigue, and people who have been on different kinds of weight loss programs, it's well known, there's actually fatigue when our brain is when we are trying to do something different. We are thinking so hard, And there's just a fatigue that wears in, and that's
Sure.
where the effort says, I don't know, maybe I can't do this.
Yeah. You know, and to state the obvious, the desire for the change has got to be greater than the effort of
That's
letting
right.
go of what is.
That's right.
So that's part of the buy-in at the beginning, which we'll get into in more depth.
Which is often, to your previous point, is, you know, change being thrust on us versus when we're driving it.
Yeah.
When we're driving it, it's something we want,
Yep.
and that's easier.
Yeah, so the more ownership there is.
That's
the more,
right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And the last one, because this has to do with relationships. The employees lack respect for the leader.
Trust. So if there isn't trust or respect in, you know, does this person know what they're doing?
Yeah.
Why are we doing this? If that isn't there, and we'll talk more about that,
Yeah.
then that's bad news.
Yeah, which
With
is
change.
critical then. That relationship is
That's right.
essential for change to be accepted and
That's right.
put forward. All right.
That's right.
Would you say that change nowadays is more the norm than the exception?
You know, I was thinking about this question, and I thought about my grandmother. She's deceased. She passed away about 3 years ago, at age 103.
Whoa.
And she was very vibrant right up to the end. It was amazing. But I think back to her life, where she was born in the early 1900s, early 20th century. The things that she saw, I mean, she lived through the Great Pandemic. She was alive when the Titanic sank. She lived through the Great Depression, 2 world wars. She saw the advent of commercial aviation, of the internet, of computers and the internet.
Mm-hmm.
So her whole life, those are major
Right.
changes. It was there. And so bottom line is, change is constant. It always has been. But I do think there's a couple factors in our world today that are affecting our perception and making it perhaps feel like there's more change, it's more complex, could be at times overwhelming. I think back to, she would tell stories where people were afraid to ride in cars because they didn't trust it, driving in a car. So, and the 2 factors I think that really contribute to this feeling perhaps of overwhelming change is technology and globalization.
Yeah.
So technology makes everything fast and a
Mm-hmm.
lot of data.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are getting a lot of information, and we can get almost as much information as we want.
Yeah.
The other is globalization. It's no longer one nation kind of a mindset, because what happens in any part of the world directly impacts us. And we know that here at DU, things going on in the Middle East are impacting what kinds of programs our colleges are looking to offer, or how they might respond.
Yeah.
So globalization and technology add complexity, which I think makes it feel more
Yeah.
overwhelming. But I don't know what your thought.
Well, from a
might be related to
generational
that.
standpoint, you know, obviously the generations coming up are used to fast change.
Mhm.
And then I would almost wonder if the reverse was true, if they would get antsy if there wasn't enough change
Yep.
in the work environment.
That could be,
You know.
certainly. And of course, the gig economy is a big
Mm-hmm.
factor where people want to do many different things. And so people are okay with change until it's happening to them. Then that's when we start
Yeah.
taking note.
Yeah.
And so all the different generations react to change on a very personal level.
Yeah. And speaking about that, and you may have some insight on this, are there certain personality types that maybe are more receptive to change than other personality types?
I don't know if it's personality or perhaps our how we approach it. So, with respect to change and personality,
Mm-hmm.
there element or a state that's closely related, and there's a lot of information and talk about this now, is resilience.
Right.
And what's been found is individuals who have a good degree of resilience, they're able to bounce back, are also very flexible. They tend to have the capacity to flex with change, to go with as things develop. And this idea of being flexible, focusing on what you can control, and being okay to let go of the stuff you can't, helps people adapt to change.
Okay.
And so the idea is that we can learn to be resilient. We can learn to be more flexible. Science has shown that we can learn to be optimistic. And those kinds of things are correlated with being able to adapt to change.
Got it.
I guess the other point I would mention is that, how we approach it. So when change is happening, some dive right in because for them they want to be a part of it, back to control. And control is not a negative. It's just another general approach is I'm going to wait and watch and let me see, which can be perceived as denial, and sometimes it is straight out pushback, but sometimes it's people just watching to see how it's going to play out. And as a manager, we have to be mindful of different approaches.
Yeah, and as we get into further in this conversation about how to implement change, obviously the idea is to implement it in a way that knowing that people will react differently.
Yeah.
So you take into account all those pieces.
That's right. That's right.
So let's roll up our sleeves and get into like how to deal with change. And of course, we're talking about all kind of change, from personal to professional. What's the difference between change and transition?
Actually, I've appreciated your definition in this area when we've worked on this together. Change, from my perspective, is the immediate event.
Right.
It's fast. It can be expected or unexpected, but then that's over. Then the transition is how we process and react. And what's interesting, even if it's a positive change, so families, people getting married, having a family, a new job, relocating, which are all viewed as very positive, we go through similar stages. And I think mistakes that I see that managers make, not willingly, they think that the change is the point. And change isn't the point.
Right.
It's the transition and helping move people through that piece.
Yeah, and so obviously, even though we're talking about how to deal with change, but really what we're talking about is the transition of change for individuals, which is the challenging part. And also, as we'll get to in a minute, implementing change, taking that into account when you lay out the change, the transition part.
That's right. And in fact, even when even if there is some reaction to the change, managers or anyone leading change can help before the change happens by laying the groundwork, beginning to talk about it. So people can actually start transitioning before it happens, but often we're so focused on, I have to make this one event happen. And
so I know that a lot of the authors out there have stages of transition. So talk a little bit about like what those might be and how you would deal with each of those stages.
There's multitudes out there, but there's a common theme to them. And they tend to follow how we react to loss.
Right.
And ultimately, on one level, change is loss. And back to your first question, which was good about why we resist. It represents loss. So we're really looking at, as a leader, a manager, a coworker, if I can just be mindful of this, it isn't just a matter of changing a schedule, because it could mean something more. And so kind of focusing, again, there's many models. Some have 7 steps, some have 8 steps, but effectively we're talking about 4. So there's the initial denial.
Right.
Some have also added fog to that people aren't sure what's going on. But then the denial, and then the resistance and anger, the exploration, and then accepting.
Okay.
And so that they all seem to boil to those. And so, practically speaking, great, but what am I supposed to do with that? Well, and you have some thoughts. You work with people in your coaching. The denial is providing as much information as possible. That's one aspect to it. Even when there's no information to provide, let people know that there's no information to provide.
Right.
But that you're on it. And be okay with denial, and more specifically with resistance. So resistance can often show around, come out as anger.
Mm-hmm.
The other piece, another point on the denial as we move into the resistance is about control. So one of the things I found helpful is when there is a change I'm instituting or involved with, the more things I can give someone a sense of control really helps, because it helps with reducing the stress and the reaction. So always looking for things that someone can control in their work world, or this can apply in the outside world too.
Would you say that the second stage that you're talking about, is that, let's see, the resistance stage, is that more emotional, whereas is denial kind of shock or something? Like, how does
the fog is sometimes denial is listed as, in the fog, but it's like, well, that really won't happen. Mm-hmm. We're not really going to do that. It's fine. It's always worked. In fact, that's one of the classic statements you'll hear. Well, it's always worked. So when you hear a statement like that, what that's indicating to me is, okay, what's up? Because they're pushing.
Right.
They're pushing back. And so the resistance is emotion, but what's ironic is that managers resist the resistance stage because they don't like it, right? It's uncomfortable. They don't like people sharing emotion. We're not supposed to be emotional at work. That's the underlying perception. Mm-hmm. And you can be emotional at work. We all are. But managers often don't let this happen, or they are uncomfortable. And so it's important to listen, acknowledge the fear, empathize, show appreciation for people's efforts and the impact it has on them. Those are really important. And you're hearing a lot more about this in the workplace when we talk about gratitude, kindness, that kind of thing, because it's been found that those kinds of behaviors are very helpful in moving people through change and actually building resilience. Yeah. So we want us to talk about it, what they're frustrated with, what they're scared. And ideally, if a change leader can share their perspective as well, even if it mirrors some of theirs, like, I'm uncomfortable too, but here's what I know, goes a long way. And I don't know if you have some thoughts on things you found, helpful with the resistance, because that's where a lot of the attention is resisting.
What it calls for is, really the people skills, the soft skills of a manager that some managers feel comfortable going to and other managers feel totally uncomfortable. But it doesn't have to be a touchy-feely kind of experience. It could be more of a very constructive, where you at, what's working, what's not, what do you need to get on board. That's not touchy-feely type stuff. And those are the kind of things we'll use with groups that are going through change. And then they're still dealing with the resistance and moving beyond it the same way. So, that's all I would really add to that, is it's not as difficult as it might initially seem.
But when employees see their manager or leader doing that, like, where are you at, or, what's working, what's not, the message being conveyed loud and clear is the manager's interested and they're aware. Yeah. And that is major with that. The exploration is where we begin to try things. Okay. And this kind of relates to another question, but we begin to try. Maybe I can do it. Let me see. So, and it's really important to establish goals. Reinforcement is really big. Celebrating small wins. Like, you did it. You went ahead and used that program to deliver. Very, very important. And then finally the commitment, and that's reinforcing with team building. We do work with units around this at this stage, really locking it in. Team building, strategic planning, visioning, that kind of thing.
Well, just a quick example. As you know, I had a car accident, right? Somebody hit me in the back and then pushed me into a truck up front. And so, of course, there was the denial. Shock.
That didn't happen.
Dizziness, not knowing what happened. What's the first stage? Denial. And then the resistance was the emotion of, oh, no, and this heavy frustration. The exploration And this all happened like within a 5-minute span.
That's
was
right.
Getting out of the car and inspecting, taking pictures, talking to the other drivers. Still not happy. I could still feel the, the denial and the resistance, but still, simultaneously moving through. And then the commitment was probably, I think in my mind, was when I called my claims agent, still at the scene of the crime, not feeling good, but at least I knew that that's what I needed to do to move beyond this immediate space. All happened that fast. And then, to be honest, during the day of that day, I kind of re-experienced all 4 of those. A little less each time, a little less, but it's not like once you move to the second one, you don't revert back. Oftentimes that can happen.
Yeah, it's a process. We go back and forth.
Sliding scale.
Yep.
So now I know you use some of William Bridges' material on transitions. His model of endings, neutral zones, and new beginnings. Talk a little bit about that.
We use this in our change management class, and it's been he's been a real thought leader for many, many years. It's a great model, and what it's looking at effectively, there's 3. There's the endings, what he calls the neutral zone, which for Star Trek fans, that's catchy, and which is fun, and then beginnings. And one of the strong themes with that whole process is we have to have endings before we're really able to move forward. And sometimes those endings don't really happen for a super long time, which could lead to another discussion or Fridays at noon. But we have to go through those. The other thing, so we have those stages. The other thing that stands out to me is that we go back and forth. And you were alluding to this, but it's like when someone's trying to change an exercise program. Right. At first they start doing it, and then we fall off of it, and we go back and forth. And that back and forth is normal before we really start exploring the beginning. But it's a great model. I recommend those of you leading change initiatives to check out the Bridges work.
Yeah, just to add a few points to it is, he talks a lot about the importance, as you mentioned, of the ending kind of being finite, or at least putting closure on the ending. And there's many ways to do that. Even if you're changing a process in the workplace or something, he would say, make a big deal out of it. Make a ceremony, a closing, christening, or something where you're really paying tribute to what was. And he's very careful to say, never criticize the past, because some people are still attached to it.
That's right.
And be very respectful of it, but have a closure.
Right.
And like we did that yesterday here. We had one of our colleagues leave. And so we, symbolically, there was a lunch, there was, a closure piece.
Right.
And that was helpful. The next phase, the neutral zone is probably the most interesting phase to me, because it's the phase in between, as you're transitioning out of the ending into the new, and there's not a lot of tangible things to hold on to. It's like if you were on a trapeze and then you had to let go for a brief second to catch the next one.
Right.
It's that brief second that you're not attached is the neutral zone. And some people fear that a lot, because it's uncomfortable, because sometimes there's answers, sometimes there's not, sometimes it's about trial and error, sometimes you're looking for direction at that time and you're not getting it. And what Bridges is saying is that's where the growth really occurs in changes in the neutral zone, and that people should embrace it and look for, when you're in it, what it means, think through it, what could we do, and actually utilize it. And, story that I've told before that you're familiar with, but like in relationships, oftentimes what you'll see is if somebody's in a relationship and let's say it breaks off, they'll immediately find another relationship, because the thought of not being in a relationship and having to deal with the emotions from the previous one, work it through, kind of rebuild yourself up, it's so uncomfortable to people to even perceive. That they try and go from relationship to relationship, and the problem is they never learn the lesson.
And then the same lessons keep happening.
Yeah, the pattern keeps repeating itself.
Right.
And so, but it's a scary part to be in because there's no tangible pieces to it. It's really about discovery.
And that's where the manager or the leader of the change really comes in, because they need to be comfortable and allow a bit of that.
Yeah.
And just flex, which can be difficult for some, but that it's okay and allow that space to occur.
And a lot of companies today, you know, because change is really more the norm.
It is common.
They're actually existing in the neutral zone on purpose because they don't want to be attached to the past. They want to keep updating and changing and flowing and always looking for new things. So they actually exist in the neutral zone.
Because that's where a lot of creativity actually is going on.
Yeah, and it's a very exciting place to be, but there's not many definitives in that way.
Right.
All right, so then let's shift gear, and I know we've kind of covered some of this, but let's just focus in. This is really probably for management or for people in their lives if they're creating change, how to implement change effectively. So what are some key tips to managers and leaders on how to create change, manage transition, get buy-in, all those things?
I call it the marathon rule. And how I liken it to is running a marathon, which I've never done, by the way, just in case you're wondering, is that many times how change rolls out is it's like a senior leadership team completed the marathon. So, and then they're like, what? But the rest of us haven't even started the race. And then they're like, well, what's the big deal? This is fine. And so there's such a big disconnect between what's happening from one's perspective, the leader often, and the rest of the group. Point being is that communicate as much as possible, as soon as possible, about what's coming, what might be coming, what this might look like. It can always change, but constant communication about a pending change. And there can be certainly some tactical things too, whether doing some team building, some more meetings, planning meetings, and involving people in the change that will be impacting them.
Yeah.
And again, not to oversimplify, but the more we involve people, then the more they're able to garner a sense of control. And that goes a long way to reducing a lot of the resistance and the fear.
Because what you're really talking about is managing the transition, because like you said, the change is ABC.
Right.
But to be mindful of the transition, that's why you give as much information as you can ahead of time, get input, get people to take some ownership, to recognize people that are starting to buy in early in the process and really develop an energy flow of why this is good, why it matters, why the new beginning, is worth letting go of the ending.
That's right.
To move to, but that takes some pre-thought, some thinking through how to roll it out to do that.
And then many will back off doing that because of the things we've been discussing, like it might be ugly for a bit.
Yeah.
So definitely selling it, what's in it for them.
And I know in your class, of course, you give a lot of specific, tangible things that people can do for that. What about you personally? Like when you're creating a change from your management style, how do you get by?
How I've done it, and I've done it in acquisitions when I've worked where we've acquired an organization or taking over, replacing a long-term leader. The key that works for me is get to know the staff, your audience. Who are they? For me, that's the single most important thing, because then everything becomes about, okay, how might I adapt what I do to support them, and so I can also anticipate how they might respond. And everyone will be different, right? Some you could make a minor change, and I know they'll be at my door saying, "Are we okay? Is something wrong? Am I in trouble?" And we're like, "No, we're just changing a process." Others are like, "Well, that's fine, whatever. Just let us know what we need to do next." So get to know people. I'm very deliberate about honoring the past. And so when I'm introducing change, I typically introduce just a couple of things, because I'm not the expert, they are. So I try to roll things in, but have the experts keep doing what they're doing. And so staging the change builds trust for them with me, and I'm honoring what they've been doing. And I've found that to be very effective. And, you know, and it's authentic. It's about them. It's not about me. Finally, I've noticed in our culture at DU, and I've noticed this in other organizations, leaders who have not been as successful managing change, they've come in and changed everything at once and thrown out the processes or the practices.
Yeah.
Sometimes you might need to if there's an emergency or there's some crisis, but often that doesn't work, and it hasn't been working well in our culture. So it needs to be a bit staged, along with getting to know your staff as you're making the changes. So that's how I've approached it.
And along those lines, how important is it for the change to be implemented in bite-sized steps?
Very much.
Yeah.
From my opinion, because we want them to keep doing what they know and what's working, because there are things that are working.
Yeah.
So bits at a time. And some people will be more comfortable about jumping in and taking more, but allowing those that aren't.
And then the beauty of that is it gives you more to recognize, acknowledge, and it creates the momentum, as opposed to something that's so significant that people are just really still struggling with.
Right.
What about, and you may or may not be able to answer this, but on our campus, can you give any examples of departments or units that have done change effectively?
You know, actually, I can, from the standpoint of it's in process.
Okay.
But an example is the facilities division.
All right.
With new leadership that came in last year. They were very deliberate about getting to know how things work and why they work as they do. Then they began to roll out some organizational changes. They communicated it, and then they involved their senior staff, brought them together to do some strategic planning, values work to reinforce buy-in. And they reached out to us, which is good. I mean, because we have that ability to help. So they really went about it in a methodical way. Now, they're in transition. So it's not done. And that's another point. It's never quite done.
Right.
So they're working through as they put in new programs. But they really were very deliberate and thoughtful about how they were going to do it. So I think that's a good example of a group that's really working.
Yeah. And you know, I was just thinking about that too, is the Chancellors' 2025 strategic plan. A lot of thought was put into rolling that out, and then subcommittees were made and feedback. A website was created that gave updates, and they come back and give, here's where we're at, here's next phase. And it was really broken down. People were involved. People had input. Anybody could go to the website and write a suggestion that they would consider. So that was done fairly well. And now I've noticed, and it's still in play, but people talk about it as if it's kind of normal. And I think that's a tribute to how they kind of rolled it out.
That's a good example.
Yeah.
It's part of our vernacular now, actually.
Yeah.
It comes up.
A surprise question for you, and you don't have to answer this, but what's the biggest mistake companies or departments, be it here or anywhere else, make with this change, like that you've experienced or that you've seen?
When the person who's leading the change or the leader make it about them and not the group or the individuals that they're leading. For me, that's the biggest, because once you do that, if it's about you, then you're not going to do what we've been talking in terms of checking in, communicating, getting to know. I think that's the biggest, because they're so concerned about how this will look for me. And I think that's what I've run into a lot.
And I remember a particular department, school, whatever, where we got called in after the change was done, and it was a last minute thought of trying to just get people to kind of vent about the change. And so they were dealing with the transition part after the very end, which wasn't effective, and then it never happened. It fell apart. It lost momentum. Where should that part have been in the process?
in the beginning. So when the change was getting articulated and set, which may happen at different levels or in different units, but then once that's is occurring, bring us in the people development team, because we can set a model and a plan. So then they start doing it right then and there.
Because if the transition piece is an afterthought afterwards, you're just going to get people complaining and being angry and venting. And it really goes direct opposite to what you were trying to accomplish at the beginning, all because you forgot to manage the transition.
Right. And anticipate that transition in the beginning.
Well, I know your class is always popular. It's called Change, Managing Your Emotions and Expectations. What kind of things do you cover in that class?
Well, we have many of the things we've talked about, and we get into more depth. We have people experience change. We talk about why there's resistance and how the transition, a lot on the transition, and ways to overcome. People are able to kind of map out a plan on a change that they're working on. So bringing it kind of full scope. And what's been happening more is then I've gone in and started working with units. So and we've had faculty, many managers, employees, and some students have been going as well. So it's really the full gamut. And some groups we talk a lot about changes in their units they're going through, and some questions and ideas about how to approach that.
So is that a 2-hour class?
2 hours.
Yep. All right.
Yep.
What other resources do we have on campus for people either end, managing the change or adjusting to the change?
Well, quite a few. Certainly there's the people development team, yourself, myself, and our team, really on both levels for the managers and the people going through it. So that can be one-on-ones. It could be I've done presentations to management teams, classes. So that piece, and whether we're just advising or we're actually becoming involved in some of the steps that they do, like strategic planning sessions. We also, for people going through, or when managers want help as well, in addition to us, we have the ombuds person, is a great sounding place. And for people who are really struggling with the impact of a change, we have our health and counseling center. And so many outlets for people to reach out to when they're going through it.
Any final thoughts?
No, I think just that themes from today is that resistance is normal. It's nothing to fight against or ignore. And the piece about transition. It's not, change isn't the point, so to speak. It's the transition.
And lastly, if you manage the transition, then you can create constructive avenues. If you don't manage the transition, you're probably going to get destructive avenues, whether you want it or not, because people are holding in.
That's right. That's a good point.
Emotions, Well, thank you, Ken.
Thank you. I appreciate talking about this.
And thank you all for visiting us, and we'll see you at the next Fridays at noon.